what happens is enzymatic digestion will break down the thin walls connecting the follicle and the ovaries. Okay, because we know that the follicles started its development in the ovaries. Okay, so it was basically well housed in the ovaries in the beginning. So at ovulation, secondary oocyte, the egg itself, the protective layer surrounding it, the zona pellucida, the granulosa cells, the cells that give the nutrient and the which has the endocrine function, as well as the cumulus, okay, the connecting cells, um, are then carried out of the ovary by the antral fluid. Okay. So that's what happens to the egg. So what happens to the granulosa cells that are left behind, as well as the theca cells? They are then transformed into the lutein cells. Okay. What happens next is that um, uh, the egg leaves the granulosa cells. Okay, the follicular area. The granulosa cells as well as the theca cells formed into lutein cells, transform into lutein cells, and they become enlarged, as well as they are filled with lipid. So they now have a yellowish appearance. Okay, and they are known as the corpus luteum. So if you can imagine the size of the follicle, between 1 to 1.5 centimeter, right? Okay, it now grows between 2 to 3 times in size. So it can become up to 5 centimeter in diameter. Okay, there's also the formation of blood vessel network, as well as the formation of smooth endoplasmic reticulum in the granulosa cells. And now it starts to secrete progesterone more than estrogen, as well as inhibin. Okay? And theca cells are the ones secreting testosterone and androstenedione, which will then be converted into the female sex hormones by the granulosa cells. Okay. Remember, I told you earlier about the inhibin being different types of inhibin being secreted at different stages in the menstrual cycle. Okay, so prior to ovulation, inhibin is secreted by the granulosa cells um, in by the oocyte, okay, granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte. So it is known as inhibin A. Okay, but after ovulation, when secretion of inhibin is taken over by the corpus luteum, okay, it's a different inhibin being secreted, which is inhibin B. But even though they are different inhibins, they still have the same function, which is it actually inhibits the secretion of FSH, because throughout the cycle, the menstrual cycle, we don't want new creation of follicle, because only one uh, oocyte is supposed to be ovulated in each cycle. Okay, putting aside the second one in some of the cases. Okay. So what happens 12 days after ovulation is there is a degeneration of corpus luteum, and it now becomes the corpus albicans. Corpus albicans that do not have endocrine function. Okay, it is only a connective tissue, and then this will be absorbed by the body. Okay, since as we can see now that it doesn't have any endocrine function, what will happen is the next menstrual cycle will begin. Okay. Why that is so is because when there is no secretion of estrogen or progesterone, there will be no inhibition upon the release of LH and FSH. Okay, well, more importantly is FSH at the beginning of the cycle. Okay, so since there is no inhibition of FSH, the follicular stimulating hormone will then stimulates the formation or the development of new follicles. Okay, that is why it is the beginning of a new cycle. So what are the ovarian? What is the ovarian cycle? Okay, there are two phases to the ovarian cycle. One being the follicular phase, second being the luteal phase. And I think from the name, you know why that is so. Okay, because during the follicular phase, we have the development of one mature follicle plus one secondary oocyte within the follicle, so within each follicle. Okay, so on day one, the follicular stimulating hormone then acts upon the ovary so that the ovary will start to have multiple follicles being developed within the ovary. Okay, but on day 7, one follicle becomes dominant. Okay, and the rest of the follicles which have developed starts to go through atresia, and they'll be phagocytosed by the ovaries later on. So this dominant follicle then starts to mature, grows bigger and starts to mature. And on day 14, ovulation will occur, right? That marks the beginning of the second phase of the ovarian cycle, which is the luteal phase. So following ovulation, what will happen is degeneration, no, the formation of the corpus luteum, okay, which has endocrine function. That means it secretes estrogen, it secretes progesterone as well as inhibin, very, very much similar to the follicles earlier, right? But after about 12 days, okay, it then starts to degenerate and becomes corpus albicans. Corpus albicans does not have any endocrine function. And because of that, inhibition on the follicular stimulating hormone by the anterior pituitary will be blocked. Okay, since it's no longer blocked, the new cycle will start to begin. The new cycle begins. Okay. Okay, I'll leave you to digest the graph on the ovarian hormones, okay, estrogen and progesterone. Okay, if you can just imagine, inhibin A secretion is very similar to estrogen secretion, the pattern of secretion, and inhibin B secretion is very much similar to the pattern of progesterone secretion. Okay. So there are 3 female sex hormones, 2 steroid hormones, which are estrogen as well as progesterone, having different endocrine functions. And the third hormone is the peptide hormone inhibin. So estrogen, the first hormone, is secreted by the ovary at a very high level, especially towards ovulation. Okay. It is also secreted by adrenal cortex glands, albeit it is at a lower concentration. So from the ovary, during the follicular phase, estrogen is secreted by the granulosa cells, but after ovulation, during the luteal phase, it is secreted by the lutein cells. And during pregnancy, it is secreted by the placenta. So there are basically 3 types of estrogen. One is a beta estradiol, which is the most potent one. Secondly, estrone, and thirdly, estriol. Okay. The second hormone, which is progesterone, is also secreted by the ovary. During the follicular phase, it's secreted by the granulosa as well as Theca cells, but at a very low concentration. But because of its function, it is needed as a very high concentration during the luteal phase. So during this phase, it is secreted by the lutein cells. Okay. And similar to estrogen, during pregnancy, progesterone is also secreted by the placenta. Inhibin is secreted by granulosa cells during the follicular phase and secreted by the lutein cells during the luteal phase. Okay, so different types of inhibin are secreted, inhibin B in the beginning, and at the end it is inhibin A. So I reiterate again, inhibin B secretion is very similar to progesterone, estrogen pattern, but inhibin A secretion is very similar to the pattern of progesterone secretion. Okay. There are many functions of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, but inhibin has an inhibitory effect on FSH. Okay, but in comparison, estrogen and progesterone have very specific functions towards the body. Okay, as well as towards the reproductive tract. So local effects of estrogen include stimulating growth of ovary and the follicles. Okay, follicles are the cells surrounding the oocyte. It also stimulates growth of smooth muscle and proliferation of epithelial linings of the reproductive tract. Okay, so that means it is involved in the growth of the cells within the fallopian tubes, uterus, and vagina. So in the fallopian tubes, what it does is that it increases contractions and ciliary activity. Okay, so during ovulation, the oocyte will be released, and then this will be carried into the fallopian tubes with the assistance of the endocrine function of estrogen. Okay, because it increases contractions and ciliary activity. In the uterus, it increases myometrial contractions and responsiveness to oxytocin, which we shall be looking at later on. It also stimulates secretion of abundant fluid in the cervical mucus and prepares endometrium for progesterone's action by inducing progesterone receptors. So estrogen and progesterone actually works together hand in hand. Okay, and in the vagina, estrogen increases layering of epithelial cells. It's very, very important during puberty because estrogen stimulates external genitalia growth. Okay, it also is involved in stimulating breast growth, particularly the ductal system and fat deposition during puberty. So, if estrogen is enough, it will um, enhance all these activities. Okay. Mm. Okay, another important function, the ones in red are secondary sexual characteristics and also in growth. Okay, the ones that I put blue boxes are the ones that involve in reproductive functions. So estrogen is very important in giving feedback effects on the hypothalamus as well as the anterior pituitary. Okay, it also stimulates prolactin secretion, but at the same time inhibits prolactin's milk-inducing action on the breast, because this this actually is important in breast development. Okay, with progesterone, less function of progesterone, but also very much important. It converts the estrogen prime endometrium to an actively secreting tissue suitable for implantation of an embryo. Okay, so it acts upon the endometrium. It also induces thick, sticky cervical mucus and decreases contractions of the fallopian tubes and myometrium when it's no longer needed. Because we know that compared to the estrogen, progesterone secretion comes much later. Okay, so when contraction of the fallopian tubes and myometrium are no longer needed. So progesterone also decreases proliferation of vaginal epithelial cells, stimulates breast growth, and this is particularly the glandular tissue, also inhibits milk-inducing effects of prolactin, and it has feedback effects on the hypothalamus as well as the anterior pituitary. And progesterone also has some effect on increasing body temperature. So how is the ovarian cycle being controlled hormonally? it involves the hypothalamus, which releases GnRH into the hypothalamo-pituitary portal vessels, and upon reaching the anterior pituitary, it induces the secretion of FSH and LH. Okay, then FSH from the anterior pituitary then goes on to act upon the granulosa cells. The granulosa cells then starts to secrete inhibin, okay, which then goes on to inhibits the secretion of FSH, okay, once it's no longer needed. It also is involved in influencing oocyte growth. When it comes to LH, LH is then will then act upon theca cells, and theca cells starts to secrete androgen, which will then be converted into estrogen. Okay, estrogen then goes on to act upon the reproductive tract that we have, I have shared earlier, and on other organs as well, other target organs which respond to estrogen. So between the age of 9 to 12 years old, pituitary, FSH, and the pituitary starts to release FSH and LH. Okay, this marks the beginning of puberty. This leads on to the beginning of puberty, which means that the female then goes on through her first menstruation, and this first menstrual cycle is known as menarche. And with that as well, okay, once it starts, there will be cyclical or automatic changes in FSH and LH concentration during each menstrual cycle. So it's an auto-regulation because of the changes in the hormonal secretion. Oh, that's another video.
During the menstrual cycle, before ovulation, small amounts of estrogen are secreted from the ovary. Estrogen stimulates the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone also stimulates release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone, in turn, causes release of additional estrogen from the ovary. The levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone increase in the blood due to this positive feedback effect. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed in the ovary and begins to secrete progesterone in response to luteinizing hormone. Progesterone inhibits the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Blood levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone decrease because of this negative feedback effect.
Okay, so that's the positive and negative feedback effects that are like maintains or regulates the automatic control of the menstrual cycle. But of course, at different stages, there are different hormonal secretion, which means that there are also different regulatory functions of the hormones with each other. Okay, that's why it can actually maintain the automatic cycles. Okay, so what happens during the early and middle of follicular phase? Okay, if you can see here, they are referenced from 1 to 6. Okay, the steps are referenced from 1 to 6. At the beginning of the menstrual cycle, number 1, we can see here that there's a very low level, there are very low levels of secretion for the estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Okay, inhibin of course is not in the picture, but in the graph, but it is still in the picture. Oh, sorry. So if we take a look at the ovaries, due to the low level of estrogen, which actually stops the negative inhibition of LH and FSH. So estrogen and progesterone has very little negative feedback effect at this moment, okay, because they're very low, they're secreted at very low levels at this moment. And this lets on the the pituitary the hypothalamus to release LH and FSH. So FSH then goes on to act upon the ovarian follicles, okay? So at the same time that FSH goes on to act upon the ovarian follicles, of course, once the ovarian follicle starts to develop, it starts also to secrete estrogen. So here we can see at number 3 that estrogen secretion starts to rise. Okay? So once it starts to rise, it has negative feedback effects on the LH and FSH. Okay, particularly more on the FSH because FSH is involved in follicular development. Okay, so at that stage as well, the granulosa cells starts to proliferate. Okay, and at the beginning of the second week, okay, number 4 here, we can see that there's one dominant follicle that is left behind in the ovary. Okay, and these dominant follicles, because it secretes a lot of estrogen, okay, a little bit of progesterone at this stage, but this has a strong negative effects towards LH, FSH, and GnRH. Okay, you can see that both of them are being blocked from being highly secreted. And point number 6, we can see that, okay, here inhibin is very high, okay, because the pattern of secretion is very similar to estrogen secretion. So at very high levels of inhibin, FSH is being inhibited from secretion. Okay, so inhibin has a high inhibitory effect or negative feedback effect upon FSH secretion. Okay, so that is the early and middle of follicular phase. So in summary, okay, if you can see here, the wavy broken lines in the granulosa cells denote the conversion of androgens to estrogen. Here, the dashed line with an arrow within the ovaries indicates that estrogen increases granulosa cell functions, and it is a local positive feedback effect. Okay. So as I mentioned, we have the interaction between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and the ovaries. So what happens next is it's an automatic cycle. In the middle of the menstrual cycle, which is the end, also marks the end of the follicular phase. At this stage, okay, we can see that the dominant follicle starts to secrete a lot of estrogen. Okay, number 7. So it reaches the peak of its secretion. So, funnily enough, secretion of estrogen at this stage, which is very, very high, has a positive feedback effect upon GnRH as well as LH. So you can see that after the peak of estrogen, LH secretion also reaches its peak due to the positive feedback effect of estrogen. So what happens to the egg is that the egg completes the first meiotic division, okay? And at the same time, FSH also reaches its peak. Okay? And this is important because it actually induces the formation of LH receptor, which leads to ovulation process. Okay, so that is the next stage in the menstrual cycle. So during this phase, what happens is the dominant follicle secretes large amounts of estrogen. And this estrogen acts upon the anterior pituitary to secrete more of LH, also on the hypothalamus to secrete more GnRH. So more GnRH is secreted. It also induces the secretion of LH from the anterior pituitary. LH surge then acts upon the granulosa cells, okay, which leads to ovulation as well as corpus luteum formation. Okay, so LH stands for luteinizing hormone. That means it induces ovulation and stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum, which has endocrine function, then starts to secrete progesterone as well as estrogen. So what is the next stage? The next stage is the luteal phase. You can see the pattern here. Secretion of LH and FSH starts to fall. Okay. How about progesterone and estrogen? Estrogen goes through a second peak, okay, while progesterone goes through its first peak at the middle of the luteal phase. Okay, what happens in the ovaries? The egg has been released and the granulosa cells that are left behind changes into the corpus luteum. And after 12 days, it then becomes corpus albicans, which has no endocrine function. Okay, so when it becomes corpus albicans, it has no endocrine function, meaning that estrogen is being secreted or no longer being secreted, and that then goes back to the early follicular phase, which means that estrogen are very low, progesterone as well is very low, and this then has a which means that the inhibitory effect on FSH is blocked. Okay, FSH starts to be secreted, which then starts to induce the formation or the development of new ovarian follicles. Okay, so that is how the menstrual cycle is automatically controlled or automatically regulated. So let's take a look at the step-by-step process. We have the LH, okay, number 11. A very high level of LH, meaning that the remaining follicular cells after ovulation are then transformed into lutein cells. Okay. At point number 12, we have the formation of corpus luteum, which secrete a lot of estrogen as well as a lot of progesterone. And this has negative feedback effect on the secretion of GnRH, LH, as well as FSH. Okay. So you can see that due to the low secretion of LH and FSH, there is degeneration of corpus luteum after about 12 days. Okay, and this leads to the decrease in the secretion of both estrogen and progesterone and leaves the inhibiting effects on the GnRH, LH, and FSH secretion, whereby they start to increase. And this marks the beginning of a new cycle. So this is a summary of the hormonal control of the during the luteal phase. We have the suppression of LH and FSH by the estrogen. Okay, so anterior pituitary is inhibited from secreting FSH and LH, as well as the hypothalamus is blocked from secreting GnRH. But in absence of fertilization, when there is no implantation, okay, when there is no implantation, we don't have any effect of the HCG or human chorionic gonadotropin, which is the pregnancy hormone. So in absence of HCG, the corpus luteum starts to regress to become corpus albicans, which has no endocrine function, so no estrogen and progesterone, which marks the beginning of the menstruation, as well as the start of the next menstrual cycle. Okay, so when we have the menstruation, it doesn't mean that that is the end of the cycle, but it is actually the beginning of a new cycle. Okay, because at the same time that menstruation occurs, there is the development of new follicles. Okay. Okay, I think I shall stop here and take a break. We will begin in about 2 minutes time.